Under the harsh glare of studio lights, Pete Hegseth thought he'd score another easy victory, an arrogant host facing a composed congresswoman. But the night didn't go as planned. Jasmine Crockett stayed calm, her words cutting through his smug confidence. Then came her 12-word reply, sharp, devastating, unforgettable. In that moment, silence filled the studio, and millions of viewers witnessed arrogance collapse before composure. In the green room, Jasmine sat in silence, her reflection steady under the makeup lights. Her team had prepared her for everything. They had spent weeks studying Pete's tactics. Every segment, every interruption, every smirk he used to unbalance a guest. She understood his rhythm, his need to assert control. She also understood that his arrogance was not confidence, it was routine. He thrived on people reacting emotionally. But Jasmine Crockett had been through harder tests than this. The memory of long courtroom nights. The faces of clients who had no one else to speak for them. The exhaustion of working through law school while holding 2 jobs. All of it sat beneath her calm expression. She was not nervous. She was patient. A text came through from her chief of staff reminding her of the strategy they had refined over the last week: stay calm. Let him overreach, and turn his words against him. She read the message once and placed the phone down. Every confrontation she had ever faced, judges doubting her competence, colleagues dismissing her intelligence, had led to this moment. The mirror before her did not show vanity. It showed readiness. She had no illusions about the game she was walking into. The Fox producers wanted a spectacle. Pete wanted a victory. She wanted truth, even if she had to carve it out in front of millions. Across the studio, Pete flipped through his notes, highlighting key phrases he intended to weaponize. Limited experience, radical policies, hypocrisy. Each line was a rehearsed attack, practiced with the precision of someone who mistook cruelty for confidence. For years, he had built a career on provocation. A decorated veteran, a man of television charm. He had turned outrage into art form. What he didn't realize was that charm without substance collapses the moment it meets someone unafraid to confront it. Pete had never truly lost control of an interview, and the thought that he might was unthinkable. For the producers, this was business as usual. Confrontation was their brand. They expected Jasmine to defend, to stumble, to lose her footing under the intensity of Pete's tone. But in politics, the most dangerous opponent is not the loudest, it's the one who refuses to play by the script. Jasmine's preparation wasn't built on countering his arguments. It was built on dismantling his authority through composure. As the countdown to live broadcast began, Pete's energy sharpened. He practiced the rhythm of his opening question under his breath, imagining the millions who would soon be watching. In his mind, this would be another triumph, another clip that would race across conservative media. Proof of his ability to put so-called radicals in their place. The control room flickered with movement. Producers murmuring final cues. Sound engineers adjusting the microphones. Jasmine sat quietly, her face serene, her pulse steady. To anyone watching, she seemed detached, but in truth, she was calculating every variable. When the theme music faded and the red light blinked on, the stage was set. Pete leaned forward, his posture confident, his tone deliberately casual but edged with provocation. The interview began like all of his others, with a smile meant to disarm and a question designed to insult. He spoke slowly, emphasizing every word that carried dismissal. He described her as inexperienced, implied she was unqualified, and layered each sentence with the kind of condescension that had worked for him countless times before. Jasmine did not interrupt. She waited, listening. Her eyes stayed fixed on the lens in front of her, not on him. When she spoke, her tone was even, unhurried, completely under control. She did not defend herself. She reframed the attack, reminding the audience who she was and what she represented. Her words carried the cadence of conviction, not defiance. It was subtle at first, the change in energy. The way she redirected the weight of his question without raising her voice. The control room noticed it before Pete did. Something about her calm unsettled him. He pressed harder, layering his next question with arrogance. He pointed out her short time in Congress, minimized her legal career, dismissed her work for low-income clients as unremarkable. The phrasing was intentional. It was meant to belittle, to reduce her accomplishments to anecdotes. But the audience watching from home could feel something shift. His tone, once confident, began to sound condescending. Her responses, quiet but sharp, started to build momentum. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her voice precise. She reminded him that serving people who couldn't afford justice wasn't weakness, it was experience. Her phrasing was exact, her composure unbreakable. She didn't need to raise her tone. Every word carried its own gravity. The viewers felt the balance of power begin to change. Pete tried to laugh it off. He referenced his own military background, hoping to re-establish dominance through patriotism. He spoke of sacrifice, of leadership, of having earned the right to critique others. But arrogance disguised as humility never survives contact with authenticity. Jasmine's reply came like a measured verdict. She acknowledged his service, but she drew a line between duty and entitlement. The statement was so clean, so simple, that the silence which followed carried more impact than applause ever could. In that moment, something subtle yet irreversible occurred. The rhythm of the interview broke. Pete's voice, once steady, faltered just slightly. He shuffled his papers to regain composure. But the illusion had cracked. The producers in the booth exchanged glances. They had never seen him this unsettled. Jasmine, meanwhile, remained perfectly still. Her poise had the quiet power of inevitability. Every word she spoke was deliberate. Every pause intentional. She was not performing. She was dissecting. The exchange no longer looked like an interview. It looked like a reckoning unfolding in real time. The air in the studio thickened. The energy, once dominated by Pete's practiced control, now revolved around her calm precision. The cameras caught every detail, the flicker in his eyes, the faint tension in his jaw, the stillness of her gaze. In homes across the country, people leaned closer to their screens, sensing they were witnessing something unusual. What had begun as a setup was slowly transforming into a reversal. The man who came to expose arrogance was being undone by his own. The woman he expected to fluster was dismantling him piece by piece. Not through aggression, but through unshakable composure. Every second of silence that followed her responses was louder than his next attempt to speak. By the time the first segment ended, the balance of the entire exchange had shifted. Pete sat rigid behind his desk, pretending control, while Jasmine waited quietly in the remote studio. Her face calm, her posture unmoved. The cameras captured the contrast, the host forcing confidence, the guest radiating truth. No one in the control room dared to speak as the feed cut to commercial. The silence was heavy, electric. Jasmine removed her earpiece and exhaled slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply sat there, aware that something had changed. Not only in the studio but in the narrative itself. The confrontation that had been meant to showcase her defeat had instead revealed something deeper. That grace under pressure could be the sharpest form of power. And as the network cut to break, viewers across the country began reaching for their phones. Already replaying the moment. Already sharing the clip that would soon ignite every platform. They didn't yet know that this was only the beginning, that the true impact of what they had just witnessed would spread far beyond one interview. But for now, in that charged silence, one truth had already taken shape. The man who thought he was about to win had just been outmatched. Not by volume, but by composure. The night deepened inside the studio. The bright lights beginning to feel like interrogation lamps. Every camera stayed locked on the host's desk, where Pete Hegseth tried to recover the rhythm he once owned. His voice carried the practiced confidence of a man used to controlling the story. Yet the edge in his tone had dulled. Across the feed, Jasmine Crockett remained motionless, her expression unreadable, her calm now the center of the broadcast. The atmosphere had shifted without anyone saying so. Viewers at home could feel it. The authority in the room no longer belonged to the man asking the questions. The control room buzzed in whispers. Producers exchanged glances, debating whether to break for commercial or let the tension play out. The director decided to continue, sensing that something far larger than ratings was unfolding. Pete cleared his throat, his fingers tapping the desk as he shuffled his notes. The questions no longer came out like strikes, they landed like defense. He tried to regain footing, moving from her background to broader talking points, hoping to reclaim control through familiarity. But the dynamic had changed. Each word he spoke only highlighted how much power he had lost. Jasmine responded with precision. dismantling generalizations with facts and measured reasoning. She didn't raise her voice, never interrupted, never lost her composure. Every answer felt deliberate, constructed not for applause but for clarity. Her calmness made his performance look strained, almost theatrical. The more she held her ground, the smaller his authority appeared beneath the studio lights. It wasn't the kind of confrontation audiences were used to. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic cutaways, just quiet dismantling. Outside the studio, social media began to stir. Viewers clipped the exchange, posting fragments of the live feed with captions that spread faster than the broadcast itself. Hashtags formed instantly, filling timelines with disbelief and admiration. Comment sections filled with a single recurring theme: calm beats arrogance. People who had tuned in expecting entertainment were now watching a lesson in composure unfold. Back in the studio, Pete's confidence wavered further. He tried humor, then skepticism, then condescension, but none of it landed. Jasmine answered each attempt with the same quiet discipline that defined her courtroom years. Every pause before she spoke was a calculated beat of power. The silence between them carried its own weight. It said more than any argument could. The tension in the air was so sharp that even the crew barely moved behind their cameras. The control room clock ticked down the segment time, but no one signaled to cut away. The moment had become too magnetic. Pete's next question came out rougher, almost defensive, a thin mask for irritation. Jasmine met it with a steady gaze and an answer that stripped away pretenses, exposing contradiction without cruelty. The exchange wasn't loud, but it was surgical, and every viewer could tell that something irreversible was happening to the man who once prided himself on never losing control. When the broadcast finally cut to commercial, the studio fell silent. Pete stared down at his notes, expression fixed but eyes uncertain. Across the screen feed, Jasmine exhaled slowly, the faintest trace of composure still holding steady. The control room didn't cheer, they simply watched, stunned, realizing they had just recorded something that would outlive the evening's broadcast. By the time the show returned, the world outside the studio was already reacting. Clips were trending, headlines forming, and the first waves of commentary rolling in. What began as a routine interview was turning into a cultural moment, a collision between confidence and conscience, arrogance and grace. The host still sat beneath the lights, but everyone watching knew the power in the room had shifted for good. By the time the show returned from commercial, the tension was unmistakable. Pete Hegseth's smile had hardened into something mechanical, the charm gone, replaced by calculation. The control room urged him through the earpiece to move forward, to pivot, to regain control of the narrative. But control was already gone. The audience watching at home wasn't waiting for Pete anymore, they were waiting for Jasmine. Her poise had drawn them in. Her words had given them something television rarely offered anymore: quiet authority. The camera framed both faces in split screen. Pete's eyes flickered with the energy of someone forcing confidence, while Jasmine's composure remained almost unsettlingly still. He began with a question meant to corner her on policy, but the words came out uneven, the phrasing slightly off, betraying his irritation. She answered as though she had been waiting for that exact moment. Her sentences carried the rhythm of conviction, each one rooted in lived experience rather than performance. Every reply stripped away another layer of his aggression. He tried again, reaching for familiar ground: military service, patriotism, party loyalty. He invoked sacrifice and duty, hoping the weight of those words would shift sympathy back in his favor. But Jasmine didn't challenge his service, she redefined it. Her calm rebuttal drew a line between serving a country and profiting from it. She reminded him, and everyone listening, that integrity is not a uniform, it's a choice. The studio fell silent, even through the monitors. The pause was heavy, electric. The crew in the booth exchanged looks of disbelief. They had seen heated arguments before, fiery exchanges that trended for a night and then disappeared. But this was different. There was something surgical in the way she dismantled him without raising her voice. The control room director muttered under his breath that they should have cut to break minutes ago. But no one dared interrupt what was happening. It wasn't television anymore, it was history being written live. Pete shuffled his papers again. He tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. His rehearsed confidence was fading fast. Every second he kept speaking made the contrast sharper. his forced bravado against her effortless calm. The more he talked, the clearer it became who truly commanded the room. Viewers across the country began recording clips, sharing them with captions that spoke for themselves. Words like grace, composure, and power flooded social media. Jasmine never broke rhythm. Her body language was measured, her tone level. When Pete interrupted, she waited. When he raised his voice, she stayed still. Her control turned every attack back on him without a single visible effort. In homes and newsrooms across the country, people began to notice the difference between noise and strength. The next exchange sealed it. Pete tried to accuse her of playing the victim, hoping to provoke anger. He spoke of responsibility, self-reliance, and the failures of her party, layering the usual ideological lines with a personal sting. The words were meant to cut deep, but Jasmine didn't flinch. Her response was simple and devastating, turning his own argument inside out. She spoke of the people in her district, of working families struggling under policies designed by people who never lived their hardships. She didn't defend herself, she defended them. The studio, the audience, the control room, everyone could feel it. The silence that followed stretched for seconds too long for live television. Pete opened his mouth to reply but found nothing that didn't sound hollow. The weight of her words lingered, echoing through the set. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer mouthed the words, "This is over," though the show was still alive. When the segment ended, the broadcast faded to black. But the story had only just begun. Online, the clips multiplied by the minute. Commentators began dissecting the moment. Journalists scrambled to transcribe her words. And the public flooded timelines with reaction. Some called it composure under fire. Others called it the most powerful takedown they'd seen in years. But one truth united them all. Something rare had just happened on live television. Arrogance had been defeated by discipline. By midnight, the exchange had already escaped the confines of Fox News. It spread across platforms, across political lines, across continents. People didn't just share the clip because of politics, they shared it because it felt like justice. A calm voice had silenced chaos. A single moment had shown that confidence is not loudness, and courage doesn't need permission. And as the night faded into morning, a headline began appearing everywhere. Reshared, reworded, but always meaning the same thing. The host who thought he could humiliate her had been undone by 12 words that would echo far beyond the studio. By dawn, the internet had already turned the moment into legend. The clip spread like a spark across dry ground, shared, quoted, remixed, analyzed. Every platform pulsed with the same short phrase. A simple line that carried the precision of a verdict. News anchors called it the quote of the year. Commentators described it as a masterclass in restraint. And for millions of viewers who had watched arrogance unravel on live television, Jasmine Crockett's 12 words had become something far larger than a soundbite. Inside Fox News, the aftermath was chaos. Senior producers held back-to-back calls before sunrise. Emails flew between executives debating whether to remove the video from the network's channels. Some argued that the viral clip was boosting viewership. Others called it an embarrassment. But none of it mattered. The moment had already escaped their control. Every platform mirrored it. Every news outlet replayed it. Every late-night host was preparing a monologue. What had been intended as a simple interview now threatened to redefine the network's image for months to come. Pete Hegseth arrived at the office that morning with cameras waiting outside the building. His name was trending in every corner of social media. Not for triumph but humiliation. The night before, he had believed himself untouchable, his career built on composure under pressure. His image forged through years of public confrontation. Now, the very skill he prided himself on had betrayed him. Every article replayed the same moment. Every commentator described the same scene. A man so used to winning a debate that he never learned how to lose one. Meanwhile, in Washington, Jasmine Crockett was already at her desk. The previous night's chaos hadn't altered her schedule. While reporters gathered outside her office, her team handled a flood of calls, messages, and invitations. News producers wanted interviews. Podcasts requested her appearance. Campaign donors were pledging new support. But Jasmine said little. She declined morning talk shows, ignored the noise, and focused on the work she came to do. Her silence spoke louder than any statement could. By noon, even her political opponents couldn't ignore it. Conservative radio hosts debated whether she had disrespected veterans or simply spoken the truth. Opinion columns tried to frame her poise as arrogance. But every attempt fell flat. The video told its own story. The image of her calm expression as she delivered those 12 words had become unshakable. It was no longer about party lines, it was about the power of restraint. Across newsrooms, analysts replayed the footage in slow motion, isolating the instant when control shifted from the host's desk to the guest's composure. Communication experts began calling it a case study in rhetorical reversal. Universities prepared to include it in debate curriculums. The headline, "How Jasmine Crockett Redefined Political Presence," appeared across the morning papers. Even rival networks, usually divided by ideology, acknowledged what had happened. She had outclassed him not with fury but with grace. By afternoon, the consequences for Pete were already visible. Sponsors were reconsidering contracts. PR strategists were drafting damage control statements. Internally, producers discussed how to explain his sudden absence from upcoming broadcasts. He had become the story, something no host ever wanted to be. The clip had been replayed millions of times. But the most telling reaction came from viewers who had never cared for politics before. They saw in her response something raw and universal. A moment where someone refused to be diminished. Meanwhile, Jasmine's office received thousands of letters. Teachers wrote about using the clip to teach confidence. Veterans thanked her for distinguishing integrity from ego. Parents sent messages saying their children had watched her and learned the meaning of composure. She didn't respond publicly to any of it. Instead, she let the silence grow, understanding that every word now mattered more than ever. Her 12-word reply had already become larger than intent. It was now a symbol. As evening settled, television networks devoted full panels to dissecting the confrontation. Experts described how the energy shifted on screen, how timing and calmness had replaced volume and dominance. One analyst called it a turning point in modern political media, a reminder that patience can be more powerful than rage. Late-night comedians joined in, replaying the clip with humor but ending with a kind of admiration. Even those who disagreed with her politics couldn't deny the composure she embodied. Inside Fox, the tension turned into damage control. Pete was advised to stay offline, to issue a brief statement about miscommunication. But he refused. Pride would not let him admit defeat. Yet every attempt to defend himself only reignited the conversation. Commenters flooded his posts with the same line, quoting her words back at him. It became unavoidable. His reputation, once built on dominance, now lived under the shadow of 12 measured syllables. That night, as cable hosts debated, and the internet continued its echo, Jasmine finally made her first move. On her official social media page, she posted the 12-second clip, no caption, no commentary, no explanation. The video played the exact moment she spoke the words, ending on a black screen with simple white text, "Composure is power." Within hours, it crossed 10 million views. The phrase spread like wildfire across timelines and headlines alike. Political strategists called it genius. Opponents called it manipulation. But for the millions who had witnessed the exchange, it was simply truth. A single line had transformed into a declaration of integrity. A quiet reminder that sometimes the loudest message is the one spoken without raising a voice. By midnight, news tickers across every major network ran the same headline. The words were clear, final, impossible to misinterpret. The night before, arrogance had tried to command the stage. Now, dignity had taken it back. By the next morning, the story had evolved from a trending clip into a national phenomenon. News outlets from every spectrum were replaying the confrontation, dissecting every expression, every pause, every syllable of Jasmine Crockett's 12-word response. For a country fatigued by noise and outrage, something about her composure resonated deeply. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Calm, direct, unwavering. That stillness became its own kind of strength. A contrast so sharp it made everything around it look smaller. Cable news panels debated it hour after hour. Analysts described the exchange as a cultural pivot, a rare moment when discipline defeated spectacle. Journalists wrote about the psychology of composure under attack. Hashtags turned into slogans, then into movements. Memes filled every corner of the internet. Some celebrating, others mocking, but all orbiting around the same undeniable moment. The host who lost control and the congresswoman who never blinked. Inside the Fox building, damage control turned into crisis management. Meetings ran without pause as executives tried to contain the fallout. The clip had already crossed tens of millions of views. Translated into multiple languages. Replayed on international broadcasts. Sponsors were uneasy. Advertisers requested explanations. And through it all, Pete Hegseth stayed silent, his usual confidence replaced by a silence that felt more like exile. For a man built on visibility, invisibility was unbearable. His allies in the media tried to rewrite the story. Some claimed the clip was edited. Others argued he had been taken out of context. But the footage was too clear, too raw, too unaltered. The internet had already claimed ownership. Every attempt to spin it only amplified the original. Viewers replayed the moment with captions like, "This is what strength looks like," and "How to win without shouting." In Washington, the ripple was immediate. Jasmine's office was overwhelmed by requests from journalists, organizers, and constituents. Donations surged overnight. New volunteers filled her campaign inbox. Political strategists compared her rise to a flashpoint, an instant transformation from promising congresswoman to national voice. Her staff watched in disbelief as messages poured in from all across the country. From union workers to veterans to single parents. Each message said the same thing in different words. Thank you for staying calm when others would have shouted. Jasmine herself refused to celebrate. She read the headlines, acknowledged the flood of messages, and then went back to work. She understood the attention wouldn't last unless she turned it into purpose. For her, the moment wasn't about fame. It was proof that power didn't have to be loud to be effective. That conviction would define everything she did next. Meanwhile, the conservative ecosystem fractured in its reaction. Some hosts defended Pete, calling the backlash unfair. Others distanced themselves quietly, aware of how toxic the narrative had become. Opinion writers debated whether the network had lost touch with its audience. A few brave voices even admitted, on air, that the congresswoman had outmatched him with grace rather than aggression. That admission alone shifted the tone of public conversation. By midweek, major publications were running features on Jasmine Crockett. The Washington Post called her a new model for modern politics. The New York Times wrote that she had changed the rhythm of televised debate. Even international outlets picked up the story, framing it as a rare example of intellect triumphing over intimidation. For years, viewers had grown used to chaos masquerading as discourse. Now, they were watching something quieter, sharper, more human. And somewhere inside that noise, Pete Hegseth's world kept shrinking. Invitations dried up. Editorials questioned his credibility. Comment threads under his old clips were filled with the same 12 words used against him like an echo he couldn't silence. The phrase became shorthand for defeat, the kind that couldn't be spun away. Yet beyond the headlines and the humor, something deeper was happening. High school debate teams replayed the video for training sessions. Professors used it to teach rhetoric and body language. Corporate seminars cited it as a lesson in leadership communication. It had stopped being about politics altogether. It was now a study in emotional control, the psychology of grace under provocation. Late one night, Jasmine finally logged onto social media again. Her post was simple, a single sentence over a black background. Integrity doesn't shout, it stands. Within an hour, it had hundreds of thousands of shares. Celebrities reposted it, commentators quoted it, even critics admitted that her restraint was impeccable. She had turned silence into strategy, letting the noise around her burn itself out. By the weekend, the world had moved from disbelief to recognition. What began as an interview had become a parable, a story of discipline defeating ego, of intellect outlasting noise. The host who once embodied dominance now symbolized downfall. The congresswoman who entered the studio as a target had left as a symbol of modern composure. And while networks replayed her line over and over again, trying to decode its magic, the truth remained simple. It wasn't the 12 words alone that mattered. It was everything she didn't do, the restraint, the patience, the refusal to descend into the performance she was invited into. As Sunday headlines summarized the week, one phrase appeared again and again: she didn't just win a debate, She changed how the game is played. By the following week, the shock had settled into something more permanent. The moment had transformed from a viral clip into a cultural landmark, a reference point people returned to whenever arrogance met its match. Commentators now called it the Crockett moment. It wasn't just a soundbite or a victory in an argument, it was a shift in how audiences measured power. Calmness had become a new form of defiance. Across the country, classrooms replayed the exchange as a study in rhetorical control. Communication professors broke down her tone, her pauses, her steady gaze. Debate coaches used it to teach students the mechanics of composure. Corporate trainers cited it in presentations about leadership under stress. Every sector found a lesson in it: how dignity could command a room louder than rage ever could. Meanwhile, in Washington, Jasmine Crockett continued working as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Her schedule was filled with hearings, committee meetings, and community events. She declined every major interview request that followed the viral wave. Her silence wasn't avoidance, it was strategy. She knew the power of restraint better than anyone now. The less she said, the louder her example became. Her staff watched as donations continued to rise, as letters poured in from across the country, as ordinary people thanked her for reminding them what integrity looked like under pressure. In contrast, Pete Hegseth's world grew smaller by the day. What had once been a career built on control now felt like a stage collapsing under his own weight. Executives debated whether to bring him back on air. Sponsors hesitated to renew contracts. Attempts to rebrand him fell flat. Every public appearance risked reigniting the humiliation. Each time he spoke, someone in the crowd or online quoted her 12 words, echoing them back like a verdict he could never escape. Late-night hosts continued to mock him, but even satire grew tired. What began as laughter turned into analysis. People weren't just amused by his fall, they were fascinated by her rise. She had rewritten the expectations of televised confrontation, showing that confidence didn't need to shout, that control wasn't volume, that strength could be soft-spoken. Her discipline had ended his dominance. By the end of the month, The Atlantic ran a cover story titled, "The Voice That Wouldn't Flinch." The photo showed Jasmine mid-sentence, under studio lights, her eyes calm and focused. The article traced her journey from small-town attorney to congressional figure, examining how one moment of composure had reshaped her political identity. The final paragraph read like a mirror of the public mood, in an era addicted to outrage. Jasmine Crockett reminded America that restraint is not weakness, it is mastery. That line echoed across talk shows and op-eds. Commentators began asking whether this was the beginning of a new kind of politics, one where discipline outlasts theatrics. Even some conservative columnists admitted, reluctantly, that her approach had left a mark. Viewers were beginning to demand something quieter, something real. Inside her district, the effect was tangible. Support surged from groups that had never been politically active before. Young voters saw her as proof that intellect could rival aggression. Community centers hosted screenings of the interview as inspiration for youth programs about confidence and authenticity. Her 12 words had taken on a life of their own, quoted in classrooms, printed on protest signs, stitched on T-shirts, etched into the language of a generation that had grown weary of noise. And still, Jasmine refused to center herself in the story. When a reporter caught up with her in the Capitol hallway and asked how it felt to end Pete Hegseth's career, she smiled slightly and said only, "I didn't end anything, I just told the truth." Then she walked away, leaving the moment behind her like a trail of quiet power. Months later, during a live panel discussion, a Fox anchor cautiously referenced the confrontation. He paused before admitting, "That moment with Crockett, it taught us something. Maybe America doesn't need louder voices. Maybe it just needs honest ones." The audience applauded softly, even through the noise of daily politics. The truth of that line lingered. Somewhere, perhaps in her office long after the cameras had moved on, Jasmine sat at her desk, reading letters from constituents. The storm she had walked through had turned into calm. But its legacy remained. She hadn't shouted anyone down. She hadn't played for applause. She had simply stayed composed when provoked. And that composure had changed everything. Her 12 words still lived on screens, in classrooms, in quiet conversations about how people face power. They were quoted not because they humiliated someone, but because they restored something forgotten, dignity in the face of contempt. And as another evening of televised debates flickered across the country, millions remembered the night when arrogance faltered, and composure became history. The lights of that studio had long faded, but the message still burned. Strength isn't in volume, it's in control. Months had passed, yet the moment refused to fade. The clip had entered the bloodstream of popular culture, looping endlessly across timelines, documentaries, and classrooms. Journalists still referenced it when talking about political communication, branding, or the subtle art of self-control under public fire. What began as a television segment had become a reference for how truth, when delivered calmly, could outlast every scream. In every replay, the sequence remained the same: the bright studio lights, the smirk of confidence, the measured reply, the silence that followed. It had the rhythm of a parable. People no longer debated who was right, they studied how power shifted without force. Communication theorists called it the Crockett equation: composure multiplied by conviction equals dominance. For Jasmine Crockett, the whirlwind that followed evolved into something quieter, steadier. Her reputation as a voice of calm strength began to shape her identity in Congress. Her colleagues sought her counsel in hearings, knowing she would never rise to bait. Her speeches grew more deliberate, her tone more refined, her audience broader. When she spoke about justice or accountability, the chamber stilled, not because of volume, but because of gravity. Her team often reminded her of the numbers: millions of new followers, record-breaking engagement, donations flooding in from every corner of the country. But Jasmine treated it all as noise. The fame meant little compared to the responsibility that came with it. She told her staff more than once that the true test wasn't how much attention she could attract, but whether she could stay grounded when the spotlight turned elsewhere. In contrast, Pete Hegseth's silence grew heavier. Weeks turned into months without a major appearance. When he finally returned to television, it was to smaller audiences, carefully scripted interviews, and visible discomfort. He had learned the cost of mistaking confidence for immunity. Every time he tried to reclaim the tone that once defined him, echoes of that night followed. Somewhere in the corners of the internet, someone would post the 12 words again, and the cycle would begin anew. Across America, people had absorbed the lesson differently. Activists cited her as proof that emotional control could be revolutionary. Educators told their students that argument doesn't require anger. Even corporate executives used the clip to train teams in crisis communication. In each interpretation, one truth remained: real strength doesn't perform, it persists. In a quiet moment months later, Jasmine recorded a short message for a youth leadership program. She sat alone in her office, the same calm lighting that had once framed her in that unforgettable interview. She looked directly into the camera and spoke softly. "We don't choose when we're tested," she said, "but we choose how we stand when the test comes." It was a sentence as simple as the 12 words that had made her name. No drama, no embellishment, just clarity. That clip too began to circulate, though at a slower, steadier rhythm. People who had once shared her viral moment now shared this one, not for entertainment, but for guidance. By the end of the year, her 12-word line appeared in articles summarizing the political shifts of the era. It was quoted alongside historic statements, treated not as a viral jab but as an articulation of a broader truth: that integrity doesn't need to shout. The Fox News interview had begun as an ambush and ended as a turning point. For one man, it was a lesson in the fragility of arrogance. For one woman, it was the beginning of a legacy built on discipline. For millions watching, it was a moment of clarity, proof that amid the chaos of modern politics, truth still had a voice. The studio lights that night had eventually gone dark, but the echo of that silence, the one that followed her 12 words, still lingered in the national conscience. It wasn't the sound of humiliation or victory. It was the sound of change, quiet but irreversible. And somewhere in that stillness, beyond headlines and noise, the world finally remembered what dignity looked like when it spoke.